Greetings gainers, and welcome to my little channel on the internet called Fitter Philosophy. This channel is about presenting my philosophical observations, which are both practical and experienced based of the world around me, and something which has greatly influenced my life and contributed greatly to my perspective of the world around us. It's the job I did for over 20 years, which was as a funeral director, as an undertaker, working in Glasgow, covering all parts of the city, from the poorest to the wealthiest, and everywhere in between. And it was never a well-paid job, but it was a remarkably rewarding job because what I did actually really mattered. And I do feel for those who are in jobs which simply don't matter, whether working in call centres or generally dealing with unappreciative members of the public, or even worse in the civil service and local government, because sometimes a job can be rewarding in cash, in salary, in perks and pensions and holiday time, but very unrewarding in the actual hours spent doing the job. So I was quite fortunate in that being an undertaker in a large European city was full of different varieties, all the different religions: Catholic, Protestant, Baptist, Muslim, both Shia and Sunni, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, evangelical, non-denominational, humanist. We had, certainly I noticed, from the year 2000 on, we had a much higher percentage of humanist funerals, where families were really looking for the memorial service and the send-off, as they would call it, at the crematorium or at the graveside, to be about the person and not about a religion. And it's quite dramatic how quickly that change happened. And I write about some of the stories and some of the people I encountered in my book called Life, Death and Whiskey, which you can find on Amazon because it's self-published, you see. And in chapter 9, towards the end of chapter 9, I talk about a character called Seafarer Tom, Sailor Tom. And I want to take an opportunity in the rest of this video to actually tell you something about this character, because as we go through life, we meet people and we get to know people. And then sometimes the people that have the most long-lasting effect on our memory and our consciousness are in fact people we meet very few times, or perhaps only ever meet once. And I only met Seafarer Tom once, and he was a delightful old man, full of life, full of energy. He was well into his 80s, and he phoned up the funeral parlour head office to make funeral arrangements for himself because he had no family. He'd spent his entire life at sea as part of the Merchant Navy, the British Merchant Navy. Although, I don't know if you're aware of this, but seafarers are actually covered by a different law, the law of the sea. So you have the law of the land for land dwellers and the law of the sea for sea dwellers. And people who have careers in the Merchant Navy are often considered, when they're offshore, to be under seafaring law. And to a certain extent that has its advantages. And being a seafarer has the advantage that if you have skills, and your skills are needed, you will never be out of work. You don't have the cost of running a car. You don't have the cost of having a house if you're single, as Seafarer Tom was, and you don't have the distractions that many people can have on land. So you're in a relatively small world with not a lot of personal possessions. And Seafarer Tom, he first boarded a ship when he was literally a young lad. He was one of 14 children to a single mother in a suburb of Glasgow, a region of Glasgow called Govan. Very significant Roman settlement in its day. And at one point so wealthy and prosperous with shipbuilding that in fact the city of Glasgow was going to be renamed the city of Govan. And there's not a lot of people who are aware of that, or the fact that Govan has 2 town halls rather than 1. But that's just a little bit of Glasgow history, and it's kind of distracting me a wee bit from Seafarer Tom. So let's get back to him. He phoned up wanting to pre-arrange his funeral arrangements through his land base, which was Glasgow Nautical College, where he was a kind of part-time guest lecturer. Or basically he went in and he sat down with young students, and he basically just shared his experience of what 65 years at sea. He did occasionally come ashore when he would stay at the sailors' mission, which very comfortable, and it's good that the seafarers would provide for themselves as they would need to do. So definitely it shows an independent streak within that community, and he was a man who was completely at ease with himself. As soon as I met him in a shipping office where he had his own little side room, and as soon as I arrived, I could hear the kettle boiling. And the first thing he did was, before we even hardly exchanged a word, was he made me a cup of tea and put a biscuit out on a plate. And I could just tell by the atmosphere that it wasn't a normal and usual situation. And I took to him immediately. He had something about him, a certain magnetism and energy, despite being an elderly man, again in his 80s, which betrayed the fact that he'd lived a rich life and a textured life. It was a humble life, but he'd been at ease with it and comfortable with it because it suited him. And when he lost his father, his mother, as soon as he left school, says, "You're going to have to find some work because we need money to support your brothers and sisters." Because at the moment they're going to school in bare feet and getting teased about it, because the other kids are starting to wear shoes. So he had just literally left school. He walked out of school, walked down the road to the River Clyde, and went up and down the ships that were there until one of them took him on as an apprentice. And he said, I said, I'll work the first month for free. Right? I'm keen, I'm willing. And he showed them dirty hands. He'd rubbed his hands in the pavement, right? And says, I've been helping digging stuff and all the rest of it. So he was smart, even at a very young age, and that never left him. He was the second ship he went to that he was basically taken on board. And bear in mind, this is heavy stuff for a child that's maybe 13, 14 years old. And he was off to sea. He would regularly send his mother letters in which he enclosed cash. Sometime the cash went missing. Other times it was fine until he found another way of sending cash to help his mum raise his 13 brothers and sisters. But they were, because as soon as he was out at sea, he made himself useful. He pitched in, as they say. And that's a naval term. To pitch in means that in the old days, one of the heavy jobs was repitching the deck of the boats to reseal it, and repitching the hull to seal off any water ingress. So he would literally pitch in with whatever job was required, and by the time he was 17, 15, 16, 17, when the captain was drunk in the ship, he would be steering it into harbour, a full-sized cargo ship. And he was a teenager. And he thought nothing of it, because he watched, he observed, he had a shot, and he just took to it. He saw all around the world. He fell in love in Bermuda, lost his love in Barbados. He saw storms over the Atlantic and glorious sunsets across the Pacific. He saw the fury and the tempest of the high seas, and he saw the most sublime and tranquil seascapes that one could imagine. He talked of being up on deck in the silence of a becalmed day, literally watching towering icebergs the size of skyscrapers just gently float past the ship. And he talked about the different characters that he encountered, from ship's doctors with drug problems who turned out to be really good doctors, to drunk captains who utterly relied on their immediate subordinates to carry them through their careers and to keep them out of trouble. But of course this was done because when you're on board a ship, everybody needs to do everything to keep everybody, including themselves, out of trouble. A sinking ship can take everybody on board, and very quickly. He made himself useful at the point where he was simply told he couldn't work in ships anymore, and he'd become so institutionalized to that he didn't know anything else in his life. So when he went ashore, he was dreading it until he was invited up to the college, the nautical college, right in the banks of the River Clyde, and he was adored for who he was and the experience he had. Of course, he was kind of out of date with technology, couldn't struggle with technology, but he loved to share what he knew with the young generation, and they worshipped him for it, to such an extent that they arranged a flotilla of boats when he did eventually pass away. And I took it, because I was pre-arranging his funeral, I took an interest and conducted his funeral to make sure that everything went specifically according to his wishes. And this is another thing I appreciated, that personal touch, the personal service. It was an important part of what I did, certainly important to me. And they actually had, really it was a simple cremation for him, but his ashes were retained in an urn. They were, first of all, there was a plan to put them on a local ship and take them out to sea. But latterly, his students agreed that they scatter his ashes over a footbridge into the River Clyde, and then a flotilla of rowing boats and sailboats and canoes and swimmers would just go past from the college, and those who knew him, as a tribute. It was very touching. It was very dignified. It was very cathartic and helpful to the survivors who knew him as a character. He almost an adopted member of the family. And when I look back on it now in retrospect, I see that in life, it's the quality of your life rather than the quantity that matters. And we meet people who embody that. And when we do, it's wise and prudent for us all just to take a little more time to spend time in their company, so that that energy passes to us and enriches our day and hopefully the rest of our life. And it was a beautiful moment, and I've had ugly moments. In fact, the next video in my series Funeral Stories, because this is the second story, the third one will be something much darker and more negative, and it will deal with someone who is incredibly negative, selfish, arrogant, and sociopathic, clinically sociopathic. And this is what you see as an undertaker. You see every facet of humanity laid bare and honesty and honest, because death does that. It is a formal and effective equalizer. And I know that when I had my white shirt and black tie and black pinstripe jacket and trousers, I know that being in uniform, rather like a fireman or a police officer or a military officer, you immediately get a certain status from members of the public who respond to you according to that status. And it's something I've encountered time and time and time again. I hope you've enjoyed this. My concluding thoughts in this story is that even now, as I'm narrating it to you, the audience, the viewer, I can picture him vividly with his tight grey curly hair, mischievous smile, and the oddest of things to remember is that when he made the pot of tea, he used old-fashioned tea leaves and not tea bags, from an old tea caddy which looked so scuffed that it looked like it had come out of a mausoleum. And in fact, it was his constant companion around the world in over 60 years, because it's the first thing that anybody gave him in his life apart from the clothes in his back. And that was a caddy full of tea, good, fresh, old school tea leaves, British breakfast tea, which was given to him by a first officer who'd covered up for him on a shift. And there you have it. Such, gainers, such is the way of the world.